Thank you for returning to Season 2 of The Voice of Kronos. The Eve Codex treats the Eden narrative as a psychology of awakening rather than a morality tale. Autonomy, in the modern sense, is often a mirage. The ego claims authorship, but much behavior is driven by deeper determinants: Schopenhauer's will, Jungian complexes and the shadow, and in Buddhist terms, craving and clinging within a self-process rather than a permanent self. Contemporary life, especially in algorithmic environments, industrializes this dynamic by multiplying options and stimuli while deepening reactivity, producing a stabilized samsara of desire, distraction, and identity performance. Within this frame, Eve is not the emblem of indulgence, but the archetype of epistemic courage, choosing lucidity over comfort and accepting exile as the price of consciousness. The counter-archetype is Nietzsche's last man, the end state of unexamined freedom, who converts comfort into doctrine, avoids inner confrontation, and mistakes sedation for peace. The entire arc argues that genuine freedom is not more choice. It is interior sovereignty, the trained capacity to see what is choosing and to interrupt compulsion with awareness. The mirage of autonomy. The modern subject is trained to experience himself as an author. He narrates his life in the grammar of agency. I chose, I decided, I believe, I value. This narrative is not merely psychological convenience. It is a civil religion. Liberal modernity, consumer capitalism, and therapeutic culture converge on a single metaphysical assumption. The self is a stable sovereign, and freedom is the maximization of its options. The Eve Codex begins by disputing that assumption at the level where it actually matters: interior causality. Autonomy, when inspected rather than asserted, proves fragile. What appears as choice is frequently the aftermath of prior conditions: drives, habits, wounds, social pressures, and unconscious complexes. The ego confuses the experience of selecting among presented alternatives with the deeper capacity to see what is selecting. The Schopenhauerian East and the genealogy of the last man. Schopenhauer is the key Western hinge between metaphysical pessimism and Eastern soteriology. He did not merely reference Indian and Buddhist materials as exotic garnish. He treated them as corroborative evidence for central diagnosis. Existence is structurally characterized by striving, dissatisfaction, and the reflexive manufacture of consolation. The relevance to the Eve Codex is straightforward. If modern autonomy is often a mirage, Schopenhauer helps explain the interior engine of that mirage, and his engagement with Eastern traditions helps explain the exit route that later thinkers either radicalize, psychologize, or reject. What Schopenhauer took from Eastern traditions. Indian thought as metaphysical confirmation. Schopenhauer encountered classical Indian texts through the European translation ecosystem of his time, especially the Upanishads via Anquetil Duperron's Latin Upnekhat and related scholarly circles in early 19th century Germany. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes his exposure to Indian thought beginning in 1813 and emphasizes the Upanishads as a crucial inspiration in shaping his double aspect metaphysics and the later development of his system. Buddhism as a practical, ethical, and ascetic analog. Schopenhauer's mature ethics and soteriology move toward a stance reminiscent of traditional Buddhism, where suffering is inescapably linked to desire, and relief is tied to the minimization of desire and an ascetic denial of the will to live. The SEP explicitly draws this parallel in its account of his asceticism. Compassion as metaphysical insight, not sentimentality. Schopenhauer's account of compassion is not merely humanitarian affect. It depends on a metaphysical claim about the porousness of individuality, namely that the boundary between self and other is less ultimate than it appears. Oxford's Handbook of Schopenhauer includes a dedicated treatment connecting Schopenhauer's compassion to Mahayana conceptions of compassion, including explicit engagement with Shantideva. In codex terms, Schopenhauer furnishes a Western metaphysical vocabulary for a truth Buddhism operationalizes as practice. The world is driven by blind striving. The ego claims authorship. Suffering follows as a structural feature. Liberation is not an improved menu of satisfactions, but a transformation of relation to desire. The template he bequeathed to later thinkers. Schopenhauer's enduring contribution is a comparative template that later modern thought reuses, even when it changes the conclusions. Primacy of non-rational forces over conscious deliberation. Suffering a structural to desire-driven existence. Compassion and renunciation as the only credible ethical spiritual counterweight to egoism. Salvation as inner reorientation, not external achievement. This template becomes a philosophical corridor through which later thinkers pass, with each choosing a different exit. Philosophers and major intellectual figures who expanded, adapted, or reacted against this Schopenhauerian East template. The best supported line of descent in mainstream scholarship runs through these names. Nietzsche, the rebel heir. Nietzsche begins in Schopenhauer's shadow and then stages a revolt, not denial of the will, but transfiguration of life through strength, creation, and self-overcoming. Even as he rejects Schopenhauer's solution, he inherits the problem statement. Modernity is spiritually sick, and comfort can be a sophisticated form of decadence. This culminates in the figure of the last man as the civilizational end state of a life that seeks relief above transformation. Schopenhauer's influence section in SEP provides orientation for this broader influence field. Edward von Hartmann, the systematizer of the unconscious. Von Hartmann popularizes the unconscious in a post-Schopenhauerian register, moving Schopenhauer's metaphysical will toward a more explicitly theorized psychology of hidden determinants. Oxford scholarship traces a lineage from Schopenhauer through von Hartmann to later depth psychology. Philip Mainlander and Julius Bunsen, the radical pessimists. Mainlander intensifies Schopenhauer into a metaphysical program oriented around nothingness and death as telos, while Bunsen emphasizes contradiction and conflict as structural. Oxford's treatment of the unconscious lineage explicitly situates Mainlander in the chain that later influences concepts like the death drive. Freud and Jung, the psychologizers of the metaphysical engine. Freud translates the problem into a clinical register. The subject is not transparent to itself. Rationality is often rationalization. Hidden drives rule the house. Jung expands the map. Archetype, complex, and shadow become the explanatory grammar for why the ego's claim to autonomy is so often fiction. The Oxford Lineage explicitly links Schopenhauer through post-Schopenhauerian figures to Jung and Freud. Paul Deussen and the Indological Bridge, the scholarly legitimator. Deussen and related figures help institutionalize the serious study of Vedanta and Indian philosophy in the German intellectual sphere, reinforcing the legitimacy of Eastern philosophy as a rigorous counterpart rather than a curiosity. Oxford scholarship notes Deussen in the Schopenhauer influence corridor. Schopenhauer supplies the metaphysical engine, will as blind striving. Buddhism supplies the phenomenology and discipline, craving, clinging, non-self, cessation. Jung supplies the psychodynamic mechanism, ego, shadow, projection, individuation. Nietzsche supplies the civilizational endpoint, last man, as the social form of unexamined comfort. Fusion of the modern philosophy of becoming. Schopenhauer's intervention is severe but clarifying. He does not merely argue that the will influences reason, he claims the will is ontologically primary. The intellect, in his scheme, is not a throne, but an instrument. It does not command desire so much as it interprets and serves it. Motive is felt before it is known. The mind then generates explanation, moral language, and coherence as an apologetics of appetite. This is why human beings can appear rational while being governed by forces they do not recognize. Reason is not abolished, it is conscripted. Buddhism arrives at the same problem through a different epistemic discipline. Where Schopenhauer speaks in metaphysical terms, Buddhism speaks in phenomenological ones. Under sustained attention, what we call self dissolves into processes: sensation, Vedana, perception, intention, and mental formations arising dependently and passing away. The I is not a substance but an appropriative reflex. It is the mind's habit of ownership. Clinging, upadana, converts transient phenomena into identity. This desire is mine, this fear is me, this story is who I am. The result is dukkha, not simply as pain, but as the structural unease produced by defending what cannot be stabilized. In Jung, the mirage is explained as a structural limitation of ego consciousness. The ego is not the psyche. It is a center of awareness that must simplify the inner world in order to act. Yet the psyche is multi-layered. Instinct, archetype, complex, shadow, and the inherited patterns of the collective unconscious. When these contents are unintegrated, they do not remain inert. They exert influence as affect, compulsion, projection, and repetitive narrative. The ego then retrospectively takes credit for what it did not originate, preserving a coherent self-image by turning unconscious necessity into conscious virtue. The convergence is decisive. Schopenhauer describes the primacy of striving. Buddhism diagnoses the appropriation of striving as self. Jung explains the ego's need to claim authorship and the shadow's tendency to act when denied. In each, the free chooser is revealed as an interpretive surface over deeper currents. This is not a denial of agency. It is a demand for a higher standard of what agency means. A person can be externally unconstrained and internally governed. He can possess civil liberties while living in a private servitude to craving, aversion, and the need for recognition. Modern freedom often expands the external field, while leaving the internal mechanism untouched. The market multiplies options without multiplying insight. The result is not sovereignty, but saturation. The self becomes a manager of impulses, not their master. Here the spiritual dimension becomes unavoidable. The mirage of autonomy is, at root, a metaphysical mistake about the location of authority. The modern subject treats the ego as a legitimate monarch, when in fact it is a provisional steward. And because it is provisional, it is anxious. Its anxiety drives it to constant reaffirmation through consumption, identity performance, and moral signaling. It seeks to stabilize itself by being seen, named, applauded, and affirmed. Yet Buddhism warns that stabilization is precisely the trap. The more the ego clings to permanence, the more it suffers. Jung warns that the ego's obsession with purity and coherence invites the shadow to return as possession. Schopenhauer warns that the will cannot be appeased, only temporarily distracted. From this angle, much of contemporary life reads as a sophisticated form of samsara. Not only the wheel of birth and death, but the wheel of stimulus and response, craving and satisfaction, satisfaction and renewed craving. The algorithmic environment does not create this wheel. It operationalizes it. It accelerates dependent origination by engineering attention. It turns the mind's vulnerabilities into predictable behavior and sells predictability back to the user as personalization. The self mistakes conditioned reactivity for preference, and preference for identity, and identity for freedom. A key analytic distinction must be made. Freedom is not equivalent to choice. Choice can occur under hypnosis. Freedom, in the stricter sense, is the capacity to refrain. It is the interval between impulse and obedience. In Buddhist terms, it is the widening of awareness, so that craving can be seen as craving rather than enacted as destiny. In Jungian terms, it is the expansion of consciousness, so that unconscious contents are recognized and integrated, rather than projected and acted out. In Schopenhauerian terms, it is the recognition that the will's demands do not confer meaning merely because they are urgent. The will may be powerful, but power is not legitimacy. This is where the Eve Codex places its first threshold. The threshold is not moralistic. It does not begin by demanding virtue. It begins by demanding perception. To take the bite is to violate the ego's most comforting dogma, that the mind is transparent to itself. The bite is the beginning of interior literacy. It is the moment one notices that I is often a postscript, a signature placed at the end of a document already written by habit and desire. It is the moment one senses that the self is not a fixed owner of experience, but a pattern of identification within experience. In the spiritual register, this recognition is simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it dismantles the ego's claim to authorship. Liberating because it introduces the possibility of genuine agency, which is not self-assertion, but self-seeing. The awakened mind is not the one that gratifies every preference. It is the one that can watch preference arise without being forced to canonize it as truth. Eve in this reading is not the emblem of hedonism. She is the archetype of epistemic courage. She chooses consciousness over comfort, lucidity over innocence, and exile over the narcotic of unexamined belonging. The exile is not merely social, it is ontological. Once the mirage breaks, one cannot return to the old enchantment in good faith. Paradise, if it is defined as unconscious harmony, becomes uninhabitable. This is the first weight of freedom, the collapse of the flattering story of the self. The ego loses its right to naive certainty. It is forced into a more austere and more honest vocation, stewardship of a psyche that is deeper than its narratives, and participation in a reality that cannot be reduced to its desires. Freedom begins then, not with louder declarations of I choose, but with the quieter and more difficult confession. I am conditioned, and therefore I must learn to see conditioning. That confession is not defeat. It is the first act of genuine sovereignty. And it is why the myth begins not with obedience, but with knowledge. This is the voice of Kronos. In the end, the Eve Codex does not ask whether you are free. It asks a more uncomfortable question. Who, precisely, is doing the choosing? Schopenhauer warned that the will moves first and the intellect follows, composing reasons after the fact. Buddhism warned that what we call the self is often only clinging, a reflex of ownership grafted onto passing conditions. Jung warned that what we refuse to integrate does not remain silent. It returns as compulsion, projection, and the solemn certainty of people who have never met their own shadow. Nietzsche simply named the civic outcome of this arrangement: the last man, content, sedated by convenience, mistaking the absence of friction for the presence of truth. And here is the decisive turn. The modern mind is trained to look outward. It scans for enemies, for validation, for causes, for someone to blame, for a spectacle to absorb. But the work of liberation begins in the opposite direction. It begins with self-auditing. It begins when you stop outsourcing your unrest to the world and start examining the interior circuitry that turns discomfort into accusation, craving into doctrine, and fear into certainty. This is not moral theater. It is self-awareness as discipline. Look inward before you diagnose the age. Notice the impulse before the opinion. Notice the hunger beneath the argument. Notice the need to be right, the need to be seen, the need to punish, the need to escape silence. Notice how quickly the ego claims virtue while the shadow pulls the strings. Notice how often principle is simply appetite wearing a robe. If there is an exile in this story, it is not exile from a garden. It is exile from the narcotic of innocence. Eve is not condemned for desire. She is marked by perception. And once you see the machinery, you can no longer pretend the machine is you. So take this with you. Freedom is not the ability to satisfy every impulse. Freedom is the capacity to witness impulse without becoming its servant, to hold discomfort without fleeing into distraction, to endure the quiet long enough to hear what your life has been using noise to avoid. This is the threshold. The world will offer you comfort as a substitute for awakening, and it will call that bargain maturity. But the last man is not the future. He is a warning. Choose accordingly. Goodbye for now. We shall reconvene again, soon. But until then, remember, The voice of Kronos is your voice.